Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Fred Wilson.
So, um, I, been a working artist for a long, long time now, and but in the beginning, I didn't know really which way what I was going to do because I, uh, I considered myself a sculptor when I was, out of school, but the direction of my work was really kind of vague in my mind, and also. Um, I was concerned that what I was interested in was not art. It was just a passing thought. I was going to make whatever I was going to make, but it was kind of a thought that passed through my head that other people wouldn't consider. Because I was just in my loft. I've been in New York so long that I have a loft, um, which I own in Manhattan, which is kind of crazy. Um, and so I just would arrange things in my studio, and I'm like, no, I think this is art. Was anybody else going to think this is art? Uh, but it made me happy and intrigued me. So that's kind of where it all started with making art. Um, and some of the things I put together, objects I put together, were, um, I just didn't see people doing things like that. And every experience that I had in the world kind of amplified that, and also my emotions would get involved with what I was seeing. Sometimes I would get angry at things I would see in the world, and it was my way to kind of speak back to the various issues that I saw that seemed to be overlooked. It was my way of getting back, or just kind of trying to understand for myself the world as I see it. So I was making objects, like just making things in my studio. But in order to make money, in um, I worked in a gallery downtown, which there's going to be a big show about it at MoMA soon, but I called Just About Midtown. And basically, my job was there to talk to artists and let them know, or for them to understand um, how, as someone who had a broader uh, images of art, young artists, what I thought about it. And then, of course, I was not much older than anybody who came in, um, and that was an interesting job that I had for the minute that I had it. And but after that, I got a job running a gallery in the Bronx, and it was a gallery that was new. I sort of formed it. It was, and I had studios up in this former public school building, and so we had artists in these studios, and I had a gallery space. So I had been just placing things in my studio around, and I thought that was there was something to that, and I didn't know what it was, but I just kept doing it. And so one of the projects I did in the Bronx, and I see a picture of it here, which is what makes me a picture of part of it, uh, was with other artists' works. I didn't consider it my artwork, but it was the trajectory for my work. It was I asked about 30 artists to collaborate with me, and they basically loaned me an artwork or two of theirs, and then I would put it in several different rooms, depending on how I thought about them. And the show was called Rooms with a View, Rooms with a View, the struggle between culture, content, and the context of art. And there were three rooms. There was one room that was like a regular art gallery, artwork was on the walls. And there was another room that looked like a historic house with I just brought in, it was a public school from the 1950s, but I made it look somehow look like a historic room in a historic house. But of course, there were no kids in it. The school was already closed, and so the Arts Council took it over, and so I got to do this in these spaces. And the third room was looked like a natural history space. Before I did all those things, I worked in East Harlem uh, with kids and teenagers and adults, senior citizens, running an arts program in three different community centers in East Harlem. And I also taught at the Met out of college and the Museum of Natural History. just back then they were hiring artists to kind of give um, uh, art classes. So those experiences really had a great impact on me because I'm a New Yorker, so I've been to all these couple of different museums, but I was fascinating to me how different they were now that I was an artist, sort of looking at them and also looking at them um, uh, as an educator too. Uh, but working in them, I realized especially between the Metropolitan and the Museum of Natural History, that they're both very similar in their structure. Both are built around the same time period, um, but they had, and in some cases, they had similar collections. If you look at Africa, Asia, Native American things, each museum had those kind of collections. However, how they displayed them, how they talked about them, um, what they left in and what they left out, where they placed them in the space, and how they designed the spaces were so different. You would never think that these things were from the same countries or the same regions. It was all the impact of scholarship in its rarefied form in between different institutions, different kind of fields. So that really fascinated me because sometimes go across Central Park teaching on one museum, then going to the other museum, and it was like a totally different experience. You know, in the Met, people would be walking around, it's kind of quiet and looking at things. And then you go to the Museum of Natural History, and it's really noisy, all the kids running around. And of course, it was dark inside the Museum of Natural History compared to, certainly then, I haven't been for a while, uh, compared to the Met. So, and by extension, how you thought about the works shifted from because of the environment beyond what the museum was saying about it. And also, I should say, shifted how they thought about you as an educator. You were, you became, what the museum would want you, whether they wanted to or not, you became part of the museum and how they saw you. People, of course, thought I knew more about Africa than I knew about, European art, which, at the time I didn't, even though I did go to Africa one of my last years of college, but still it was neophyte. So, I mean, it really affected, and people would come over to me and ask me, like, what do you eat? What do they eat? I'm like, all right, this is a little too, this is a little, you know, things, weird things like that. And they never asked me that at the Met. I mean, obviously, it was just because the way that things are displayed there is in these, beautifully, but it really is sort of taken out of the context of Africa or other areas of the world. Whereas in Natural History Museum, it was deeply contextualized in, anthropologists' view of what those spaces should be like. So that really made me think about it. So I did this show with these three spaces, and this only shows one of them, but you know the regular gallery, and then you know what a historic room looks like. So I borrowed these artworks, and that I thought made sense in these rooms because at that time, this is the late '80s, uh, people were really beginning to think about their background, their heritage. So um, so the artwork really kind of mimicked that, imaged that. And the one that was the most kind of striking that I created was, of course, the natural history space. That's the historic room, and this mantle um, I put in there and just put up these walls and borrowed things from various people. Some artists had these little arcane collections of things. And then I had the regular art space with every artist had an artwork in two rooms, and so all the artists had their work in this regular space, the white cube as they would call it, and they'd have something either in the historic space or the space um, or the other space. And this space really fooled people. This was in the South Bronx in an old public school. And people would come in and they look at these things. They look at that pile of heads, which was by a New York artist, and they they would say, "Oh, you have a collection, like a collection of, historic or Africa, whatever they thought this was. And I said, well, no, that was made. That's by a contemporary artist. And we had school groups coming in, and they'd look at the railing, and there would be a label, and everybody knew how to go around this room, but they had no idea what it was actually, because even with the label, which said "Pile of Heads," made 1980 something or other, um, with the artist, we didn't have any artist names on these things because it was my Natural History Museum, and where you find anybody's name on anything in a Natural History Museum, so I didn't do that. But of course, this is a woman's work who had work in the regular white cube space with had her name on it, and the works looked very similar. And I had groups coming in. Well, school groups would come in and look at the label and look at it, and they thought they understood this work, but it was not a historic work, but they didn't see it that way. They saw it as something from a Natural History Museum, and they even a curator came in with a group of you know donors and said, "Oh, you have a collection, like a collection of historic art, or." And it wasn't. It was just things by contemporary artists. But the environment really shifted how you thought about the artwork. And because I was going back and forth between museums to teach, it was amazing. I always thought that was happening, but you couldn't really tell because you're too deeply embedded in that environment. And by creating my own space and seeing people's reaction, I realized the space was really controlling. All this was controlling how you thought about the art and the artworks, and even that they were actually contemporary artists, even though it said on there, that it was when it was made. So this was really fascinating to me, how the space controlled your thinking about the artwork. So this was, I got a great review in the Times for this exhibition as an exhibition, and it was, but it really, for me, it was just, it made me really understand how the environment can really shift meaning, and I was really interested in meaning, and so I really tried to look at the environments of museums and such to sort of gather what the space was doing to the artwork, and then I try to get that into my artwork to sort of prove that the spaces project something on the artwork that you're not in control of as the artist. This work here was called the Colonial Collection. These were all my things, and that I bought in front of whatever at the time was the Whitney Museum. This guy would be selling things, and I'd buy them. And it was like this. So people, and as I put this up, this was at a gallery, commercial gallery. They'd walk in and they'd see this and they'd say, "Oh, well, I'm looking for a contemporary art," and then they'd walk back out. Well, I was the contemporary artist who put this together, but it was called the Colonial Collection, and each of these masks had French or British flags wrapping them. And we all know that so many of the museums in Europe have these things, and they're hostages in these museums. So my work often had these kind of political edges to it. And but actually, a real museum invited me to do a project in their space. It was the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore, Maryland, and that place hadn't thought about museum display in a very long time. And but for some reason they allowed me to go in there and move things around, and I found interesting things like these chairs and this large wooden thing, which was a whipping post and never shown. But I asked the curator. She said, "I don't know what they thought of me, but I was just pulling weird things out of their basements." She said, "Oh, that was the public whipping post. They used that till 1958 in front of the city jail. And we got it. We don't know what to do with that thing." And I'm like, "I know what to do with that thing." And I sort of arranged it with these chairs, basically representing various individuals, patricians in the society, looking at this grisly thing, and it had never been exhibited. I also saw the silver in their silver their metalwork area, and I just also in the basement found in their ledger books shackles, and so I put them in the case with the metalwork. And of course, the curators were just like, they were like, "Ugh, I can't believe he's doing this," but the director brought him in there, and he will have to pay for this anyway. So they let me do whatever I wanted to do. And so I put the slave shackles in the middle of the silverware in this space for the decorative arts. And so, it's also made of metal. So I put that in there. It didn't say anything besides metalwork and said the dates basically from slavery to when these silver things were made. So I did a lot of things like that. But in my studio, that was the first project, and then after that, every historical society in America wanted me to come and sort of redo their stuff. But I really just wanted to try. I wanted to make art as well, individual pieces. I was working a project in North Carolina, and I just, you know, didn't never like these characters. There were a lot more around back then than now, but certainly in the South they would be everywhere. And so I paired these two things: this photograph of, early image of a family, an enslaved family, and these replicas, and on it said "mine, yours." Oops. Uh, just because it's a way for me to sort of exercise these uh, these objects and get them out of my system in a way. Just putting it onto for others to kind of grapple with, rather than just me. And this I'm going randomly with all my different works. This one is called Guarded View. I was a museum guard in my college museum, and I always was a wild thing. I always would stand there, and you were on display like everything else, but you're also invisible. So to the public, and so I wanted to give them some visibility. And these are museum guard uniforms of 4 different museums in New York City. The guards loaned me them for this project, but of course that project is now at the Whitney. This work is at the Whitney. It's called Guarded View, and they inform an important role, but really they are on display like everyone, but they're also invisible, and I wanted to make them visible. And when it first was displayed at the Whitney Museum, the guard would stand next to it. They loved it. They would stand next to it, and then someone would come off the elevator, and they'd move, and the person would jump. It was great. I had visited Egypt several times. My father was working in Egypt. He was an engineer, and he rebuilt Port Said. Well, he was the chief engineer for rebuilding Port Said after the war there. And so I became interested in Egyptian culture and art and history. And so this piece here is called Gray Area because at the time there's a book called Black Athena that had just come out about who are the ancient Egyptians and how have they been imaged. This one is called Met of the Muse, more recent work, at least in the last 20 years, 15 years. And these are just two figures that I bought and I cast. This is a Egyptian figure that was actually at the Louvre and somehow made it into an antique store, and I bought it. And this is kind of a European figure, and I like juxtaposing things because sometimes two different things come together and they have a third meaning appears. Uh, this museum had a lot of cigar store Indians, and there are a lot of museums, old museums have cigar store Indians. And so I put them all on view, and the label says it's portraits of cigar store owners, because they certainly aren't don't look like any Indians. I have lots of friends who are native, and so they didn't look like any of them. So I figured, this really must be about the owners and not the Indians themselves. The reality is really not there. And I also borrowed photographs of the local native community because I asked the curator where I'd like to meet with the indigenous community, and she said, "Well, there are no Indians in Maryland." I said, "Oh, really?" So I sort of found the communities, and they loaned me photographs, and so on the wall are family photographs, and then on here are these fake Indians. So I do like to contextualize things that seem to have a specific meaning, and they really don't. They have the meaning that the institution or historians have given them, and they can be interpreted in many, many different ways. Um, I worked in Pilchuck, which is a glass school in Seattle, and I started making glass things in glass, and I represent the U.S. in the Venice Biennale years ago, and so I started making glass image objects there, uh, mostly about Othello. That's one that's oh, in black glass. That's one of them. Um, and oh, this I like this piece also, which is called Atlas. And basically, this is a mapping of the black world. I really didn't like these little things, tchotchkes that you could find, and so I tried to either change them or reveal something about them, and this becomes my atlas for the black world. It's the only paintings I've done. These are all African flags without their colors, and I have all of them done on canvas, and I've stripped them of their colors and then to do research about the meanings of these flags and what the colors mean. And I had other plaques talking about what the colors mean, which relate to culture, history, and various kind of tribal affiliations. So I mean, it seems like I'm going back and forth, but everything sort of moves in a particular direction. This here, it was in the um, Istanbul Biennale, and I made all the work in Istanbul, and of course it was about Istanbul. However, one thing that even many of the Turks didn't realize that they had such a large African population there. In fact, a lot of people in Istanbul itself thought that they were kind of immigrants, but no, they'd been there for generations, and they themselves didn't really know anything about their history. Of course, they came in through this as slaves, their great 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 grand parents, but really it's only been since the global interest in the African diaspora, the global African world, that they're kind of become, and of course with the internet, become a part of this global African idea, and now they call themselves Afro-Turks when they had no status. There were the Kurds, who the Turks knew, and other groups, the Armenians, but wherever the Turks plundered or ever became part of Turkey, people were from there, and they knew exactly where they were from. Well, the Africans had no idea, and in the most recent years, that has become very clear. And they live in certain cities, and now they have various things to find out where exactly they were from, and the various festivals and things they're trying to reconnect with. So I connected with them, and the project was called Afro Kismet. So I got a lot from them. Oh gosh. Oh yeah, here it is. This one all the way over there. That big wall is a tile wall which I had made, and in their famous historic tile factory. And I used their historic colors, but I switched them around because usually the background was white and everything sort of would sort of look very different. And so I made the background black, and the tile people were saying, "Oh, you can't do that." I said, "Why can't I do that? It's one of the colors." He said, "Well, you won't be able to see anything." Well, I said, well, "Just do it, and we'll see what happens." And of course, you can see everything. And in the center, it's Arabic, which the Turks don't really read Arabic. It's the historic religious language. Like many groups have religious languages. Some people speak it, some people don't. But they sort of most Turks, maybe they can read in the Quran, but they don't speak Arabic. But this says "Black is beautiful" in Arabic, and you see Arabic in the mosques or in historic spaces. Are people familiar with Oda Benga? I was in museum that, and unfortunately I don't have all this great images of it, but going in their storage, and I do a lot of going in storage of museums. Now they invite me in because of mining the museum, and I found in this storage room many plaster busts of people of color, and this is a dark one, but I found this one of this boy, and he looked familiar. And as it turns out, his name was Oda Benga, and because there was a book about him that I had not read a while ago. He was from Congo. He was brought to the United States to be a part of the World's Fair in 1914, and was on display like people they brought from all parts of the world. But his so-called benefactor kept him here and brought him to New York City. And they didn't know where to put him, so someone with their infinite wisdom put him in the Bronx Zoo in the chimpanzee cage. And the black community just sort of wasn't having it. It was in the New York Times, 1914, 1915. And so then he was moved from there by his benefactor to the Museum of Natural History. And so, he was kind of stuck here. He eventually, his benefactor was not so great as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, he eventually was moved to what was it, an orphanage in North Carolina, where he shot himself because he wanted to go back to the Congo, which was really in bad shape at that time. But it was World War I, and so no ships were going back, so he couldn't not go back. Of course, he spoke very little English. He didn't speak, nobody spoke his language, and he was always constantly on display as an object, essentially. And so he shot himself. And there's a great book about him. And so I when I saw that, I knew, I know who this is, and so I made a cast of the bust, and what it says underneath it is, I'm the one who left and didn't come back, as if he was speaking to the people, and he left in the Congo. I make these chandeliers because I represent the U.S. in the Venice Biennale, and so I continue to make them, and they have meaning for me, and they're all different. So I'm always looking for different materials and different ways of working. And more recently, I have been making, with this project, with more art, I kind of was interested in metalwork, and so I knew that I wanted to make something that used decorative ironwork, because I think the decorative things often cover up the ugliness and in various forms. And so I decided this was a great opportunity to make this artwork with the decorative ironwork and with notions of mass incarceration and slavery and to me it's sort of this combination of things that of also how the decorative covers up the horrific. I think of Trayvon Martin, who was walking through this gated community, beautiful gates, beautiful lawns, but it was the most unsafe place he could have been. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about anything I've said, or any other questions. I'm sort of gapping away. Yeah. Oh, no. I just, well, I worked in a gallery, and so that, just, you know, I knew what galleries are supposed to look like, but these were, these rooms were not like, they were not hard to design because I was sort of trying to mimic other specific kind of spaces, and and so that's kind of what guided me. And of course, I'd worked at the Met, I'd worked at the Museum of Natural History, mostly in the education department. But you get to know a lot of people there, and you absorb what they know, and so that's kind of how I went about working on these projects, because it kind of was a direct conversation with the museum community and their blindnesses and how they, because back then they thought, I mean, their audience was very limited. Who they thought was their audience was very limited. you know? But of course, everybody goes to some of these museums, or a lot of people go, and from all different backgrounds. And certainly at the time, these museums didn't have a wide variety of backgrounds in their staff, at least in the upper levels. And so, all this was kind of eye-opening to these museum people. I didn't have, I wasn't a museum designer, but if you work in museums and you're an artist, it's not hard to kind of figure that out. But kind of trying to shift what they see every day, so they can actually see what they're doing, because they really were not aware of how they were, what they were speaking to the public and what they weren't. And to a degree, they've all of a sudden kind of at least have or more inclusive and having a wider conversation. But back then it was really rough, because and even not even that long ago, because they just were talking to each other, talking to themselves, and didn't really have an expanded dialogue with others who actually do come to the museums. And so I just had to, rattle the bushes and shake them up a little bit. The director of the Historical Society was fired after this show. 55,000 people came to this little museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and he was fired by the board, not because the show was a flop. It was just the opposite. It was so successful that people coming to the museum and the newspapers said, well, now what are you going to do next? How are you going to change? And that's not what the Board of Trustees wanted. So they fired the director. And, but he understood, he said, he didn't blame me. He actually didn't have any new ideas himself. And so that's why I got to do the thing in the first place, because I was working with a contemporary museum who collaborated with this historic society, because nobody was going there. I went there and one day, and all these ladies in the antebellum outfits were in the lobby. They had these kind of I don't know, these groups who sort of think about the past, and so I was always looking for my free papers when I was in there. But besides that, it was an eye opener for all of them, and it went right back to being what it was after I left. The guards, because I made friends with the guards and the maintenance and the who were all black, of course, and they say, man, you need to come back here. It's just going right back to what it was. Well, that was a long time ago. Now, I just went back recently, and totally different place. They even changed the name. It's like this place, actually. And of course, all those board members were long left, or they're kicked the bucket, one or the other, because this was in 1991. I'm still here. But so it is a totally different museum than it was back then. But they had the same stuff, but they're really interesting how they work with it.
How were you able to get in cahoots with the director?
Well, it was a perfect storm, because the director, the reason why I actually got me to do it, they wanted me in because they had a huge museum conference coming a year later, and he was like, he didn't have a special show for them. All these museum directors and all these museum people were coming to their little museum for their conference, and he didn't have anything snappy for all these museum people to see. And the contemporary who wanted to work with me, because I had done those kind of fake museum spaces, they said, well, maybe Fred can do this in a real museum. So the director of the Contemporary, which was a museum without walls in Baltimore at the time, uh, the director of, and it was friends with the director of the Historical Society, and the guy said, well, the director of the Historical Society, well, how can I make the Chippendale furniture relevant to the local community? Because, Baltimore is like 85% black, and, it was not what was going through the front door. Let's put it that. And that was not who was going through the front door. So this director said, well, I think I have somebody for you. And of course, nobody knew my name at that point. So he said, okay. And basically, my office was the president's office. I sat there, and he kept walking by and saying, is it art yet? And I'm like, it will be, don't worry. And just looking through things and talking to people. I talked to everybody in the museum to find out their perspective of the museum, because I'm not from Baltimore. And certainly not a historian of Baltimore. And including the lady who cleaned the silver and the maintenance people, and just to get a sense of the environment. And then went outside the museum and spoke to, gave lectures to other community groups, Knights of Columbus, whatever kind of groups, ladies' clubs and things like that, about my work, basically. And so that it wouldn't be a total surprise when they went to the Historical Society. Well, of course it was a total surprise, but of course I got to understand Baltimore more. I'm a New Yorker. I'm not from Baltimore, so that was really good for me, because I didn't want to push it to the degree that they would just fall down dead, or just sort of have cardiac arrest or whatever. But I did want to move the needle to sort of understand what the possibilities, but also embedded in this museum. What's actually this place about? And so I forgot your question, but that's kind of with that one how it went. And so the curators just went along with it, because they said, that's going to be on his head, not mine. Okay, the director's head. So they were very, you want to bring out that whipping post? All right, you bring out that whipping post. And so, yeah, and so it was. That's kind of how it went.
So after working in so many museums, how was it different creating a public art piece?
Yeah, public art is a whole other. Working within an institution is one thing. Working outside of an institution, where everybody can have everybody has an opinion, and they're supposed to have an opinion, and you can't speak to. On the historical side, I knew who the audience was within the institution. I knew the type of people who came to the institution. But in the real world, putting art out, everybody has every different kind of opinion, so you can't control that. So you have to really go as deep as you can within yourself to make it as real for you as you can possibly make it. And that's what you have. That's what you do. It's the tricky part, because people can love it, they can hate it, they can, it's out there. And that's yeah, especially for somebody like me, it's a tricky thing. Some people, they make something that will look good on your front lawn, or in your house, or can go anywhere. But I'm largely site specific, and so that is which people can understand, because if they're from the area, can get, well, if they know that Beecher, who he was, that the courts are there, that Columbus, everybody sees Columbus there, and hopefully it slows people down to think about how all these things interact or don't interact, and things that you just walk by and not think much about. But it can have various different people can relate to it in various different ways, love it, hate it, or not get it, so it's public art for someone like me is a challenge, because I want to be as real as possible, but you just don't know. how it's going to be effective. You just put everything, like with all art, you put everything you have into it, everything about yourself. You don't hold back. You put it in there because it's real. It's real to you, and if it's real to you, then it's you're doing something that's only going to be like you. People wonder, well, how, I don't want to be like so and so or something. I want to make my own work. Well, you just have to go that extra bit and make it work to the degree that it really means something to you strongly, and then you of course have others that you trust kind of talk to you about how they feel about it. I mean, by now I don't asking other people anymore, but my friends, they just come and see it, and but when you're making your work and you sort of have many different ideas and you're going in different directions, and you just sort of feel the temperature. You don't have to tell anybody that you're actually interviewing them, your friends, but it's useful to kind of understand from somebody else's perspective what you're doing or how they see it. It's not even know what you're doing. If they're seeing it in completely the opposite way, then there's something you have to think about. But then if they're artists, but the general public are going to think of it in all different ways. So you really don't. And so putting something outside of an institution, outside of a museum, people coming in to see art, and to a degree, they can like it, hate it, but they understand the realm that it sits in. But in public, people coming from all different directions, not necessarily wanting to see art, or loving to see art, and they're reacting to it. So um, it's an interesting environment to work in. Like I've had things happen that were really great, and things that didn't work out the way I thought. But yeah, so but of course you have to, in the end, you have to really love what the thing you're doing. You have to be very supportive of the thing. You can't be, if it's in the public, you have to really be able to kind of talk about it, why you did it and why it made sense to you and why it's important.
Like, did you have trouble getting recognition being a black man in the, whitewashed art
Yeah.
world?
Well, it's a funny question. It's funny. I can laugh now, thankfully, but we were just completely invisible. We had separate galleries, separate everything
Really? In the
in New York
80s?
City in the
The
80s, yes,
Wow.
90s, uh, and of course, prior to my entering the art world, it was completely separate too, and there was maybe one or two artists that the mainstream art world knew about, like Romare Bearden was the one person, or Jacob Lawrence. Those are the two that they knew, historic figures, who were still alive at that time. But really, if you were a person of color, we all had our different. There was a Latino alternative gallery, and the black gallery, and the Asian gallery. I mean, we all went to each other. At least I did. Go to all the other openings of all these of everybody else, because in my world, I grew up in a very multicultural environment, and so it was just natural for me to kind of go to everything and see everybody's work, and so we kind of supported ourselves. And just I remember this artist Jimmy Durham, who's native artist. We'd sit in a bar and we'd say, "Well, this is like in the '80s. Oh well, the Germans in the '80s, Kiefer and I forget all the other names of the German artists. All of a sudden, it hit New York, and that was the big thing. The Germans, and then the Italians came, and who was the I can't remember. Who? Clemente, yes, yes, and his group, and some of them you don't hear their names anymore. I don't know what happened. But then we sat there. So when is it going to be our turn? We just laughed because we thought it's never going to be our turn. It was just like an impossibility. And I worked in museums, and I worked in alternative galleries. There's a lot of alternative galleries back then. Now it's just almost entirely commercial comparatively. But the government was giving money to these alternative galleries because it's all our money. So why not, shouldn't just go to Artist Space or one particular gallery. But, you would never know that this was the situation now if you came to New York. I mean, that is like, they like closed the door on that. Like it didn't happen. And of course, meant that you didn't get reviewed in any of the magazines. There were no black reviewers. There were no black. It was just, total, completely a separate universe, and which was sad, But some of us, I don't. Oh, you know what? How it really changed? And sometimes I tell people, and this is a long time ago, but still, that was the first thing that happened. Was there was a huge recession, and I was in a commercial gallery. I was in Metro Pictures, and a few of us eventually by the early what was that? Gosh, the early '90s. But what happened was, maybe it was before I was at the gallery, but anyway, there was a huge recession, and so the galleries were not selling anything. So back in that time, there were a lot of alternative galleries that were paid by the government, so they could invite anybody they wanted, and they did. So they were not making any money with their regular fare. So they could really, it wasn't about the bottom line. It was just kind of keeping things interesting, so people didn't forget the galleries, or just wouldn't stop coming. So they started looking at the alternative galleries, which had all of us in them, and not only Black, Latino, and Asian, and women, but a variety of people who did not somehow their work didn't fit in the mainstream, and they started grabbing from them because they wanted to spark the market, put something in that nobody's ever seen before, because it's like, because they were ignored basically, but that's not what they would say. They would all of a sudden find this great artist, and it was basically to sort of make people back interested in the art world. And that was the first salvo of changing the galleries, commercial galleries, because they're private companies. They can do whatever they want. The museums, shame on them. But little by little, and there are a lot of these different pressure points are put on them, and different things that made them, like their bottom line, made them more intrigued with things that they had never seen before. But because even some of the major alternative spaces would say, well, we're looking for quality. We're looking for quality. It's not the person, it's the quality. But in fact, they had no idea what we were doing. They had no idea, no basis to understand what we were doing. I was kind of a bridge because I was using their stuff to talk about my stuff. But they had no understanding of what was, because they didn't know any Black, Latino, Asian people. So how would they know what the culture, what's based on? And so they thought it was nothing. And they use the word quality all the time. Well, we're looking for the highest quality. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. So yeah, it was really weird. That's all I can say. But it's not like that now. It could get better, obviously, but it's not like that. It's the same people.
For most of the sculptures that you make, what type of materials do you use?
Oh, well, I keep, it's not the material, it's the idea that pushes me. And I use whatever it takes to make that idea. However, I have because I'm in the gallery system too, it is kind of interesting how that affects you, but it's not in a bad way for me particularly. But I started working with glass and got really intrigued with it, and then started making things in glass. And then when I represent the U.S. in the Venice Biennale, I made my first, huge. It was not too long after. Was after 9/11, and the whole world shut down, including the art world. But then when I was in the biennial in 2003, um, in the American Pavilion, I had just glass was in my head, I always say. And so I made this huge black chandelier about Othello. And because Othello's the greatest black Venetian that never lived. But, and so so glass became my material for a long time. I still love working with glass. I still go to I'm going to Venice next week to work with my glass people. And but now I'm also moving towards metals, and this was this wonderful opportunity to kind of work to do this project with more art because it and on such a scale it's really fantastic. But I have another project in Charleston that also is metal, and I'm going to continue to work with this material if I can until I feel satiated and I want to move to something else, or I want to combine glass and metal, or whatever. Who knows what it'll be? But yeah, and a lot of my work, we didn't talk about it, requires research because because that's kind of a great underpinning to some of my ideas. It makes me dig deeper, like the Africans in the African culture or the African people in Istanbul, but also just the history of some of these materials. And interestingly, personal note, I was in Charleston and I made I was going to make this metal sculpture, wrought iron sculpture with some of these metal workers there, and my cousin came down because I gave a lecture, and I didn't know her really well, but because she was kind of not a direct cousin, but she was in the art world that I didn't know, and she came down and from DC, and she handed me at the end of my lecture an envelope, and she pulled it, and in the envelope was the manumission papers for our direct descendant, and he was the wife. She was bought out of slavery by her husband, and her husband was a blacksmith. And this was just like, I still get choked up about it. How I had no idea. And here I was for years. I have volumes of images of metalwork, from New Orleans, from around Europe, in Senegal. I've got some great pictures in other parts of Africa. And all along, this was like in my DNA. Of course, I'm not. I'm sure this guy was a bruiser and could do. My ancestor was like a strong. I'm not built for making these things, but it just was fantastic at that moment for that to kind of. That was just like amazing that it happened. So you never know, and you never know the reasons why you'll go into different things, but you just have to follow something. You just never know. Follow something you really makes you just want to make art. Something about you and something about the world and something about, whatever. But it's like it has to be really true and not look away from it because it just seems like, who wants to do that? Well, why would I want to do that? Well, if you want to do it, you better at least check it out. It may go nowhere, but it may really be who you really are. So anyway, thanks. Oh my goodness, what did I say? Oh, shit. Okay.
Well.